The most interesting way in which the Pink Book puts the digital landscape into context in for the job of doing anthropology is that it has forced a lot of people to become kind of acquainted with the ways that we're doing things, and that for a very long time anthropologists had been assuming a lot of things about their neighbors, about their people in a way. And in as much as originally it took those travels around the world for anthropologists to realize that there were different cultures out there and different ways to live, the digital revolution has made people more aware of the diversity of voices that exist out there. And that is in part due to the fact that we can communicate with a whole lot more people at a time, of course. But it also has to do with the fact that now you have entire generations that are suddenly living their lives completely differently from the way you knew. And so from the reading for this week, there is this explanation of the unorthodox part of digital ethnography, saying that it requires attention to alternative methods or forms of communicating. Each of the chapters in this book features 3 examples of ethnographic writing drawn from the author's own research at different physical and digital sites around the world. These examples are based on projects that account for the digital as part of the environment of everyday life or as research technologies or both. The examples through the book show that or how taking a digital approach enables us to acknowledge and seek out ways of knowing about other people's worlds that might otherwise be invisible and that might be anticipated by more formally constituted and thus less exploratory and collaborative research approaches. They also account for the research process as being inextricable from the ways in which ethnographic knowledge is produced, thus, in some cases, incorporating a degree of reflexivity into the ethnographic writing process. As instances of writing digital ethnography, these offer readers a set of examples of both what we might learn through doing digital ethnography and how and where it might be practiced. And as a result of that, if you are considering several different subjects for your final project this semester, you might be interested in just giving a quick look at how those examples are unfolding in the Pink Book in the reading for this week, because it has a bunch of examples of how this has been done before. And even though in this case it was 15 years ago already, it has still a lot of relevance to the way in which this digital ethnography conceit might be played out in a real ethnographic context. For our purposes, though, it is also very interesting to put this new way of research in context, because it is the ways in which the technology is used that seems to change the way that people are interacting. And somehow, seamlessly over the course of anthropology or doing ethnography, the digital methods have appeared in and of themselves by people using digital recorders and computers to take notes. And those are, in fact, digital tools that we have been using as part of our job. And so it is not entirely surprising that that world has changed underneath our feet, but yet many people have not realized how much it has impacted them. And this is part of a much larger context of how the digital world is increasingly just something that is given in part of our lives. This article, dated from 1999, looks at net cafes or cyber cafes, kind of this weird old place where people didn't used to have the internet. You would go to what is called a net cafe or a cyber cafe to access the internet for a fee on their computers. And this particular one here is happening in Africa. Observations and interviews during my fieldwork at Net Cafe suggest an approach which borrows metaphors of speciality from cultural geography to explain gender in terms of its production as parts of landscapes of computing. Landscapes of computing are defined as the overlapping set of material and imaginary geographies, which include but are not restricted to online experiences. The choice of an internet cafe was influenced by its role in relation to the internet and computing more widely. A cafe is a translation landscape of computing where the internet is produced and interpreted for quote unquote ordinary people who consume time on the machines and or food and drink. My initial question was, how do the staff achieve this production and interpretation? Additionally, there was the possibility that Netcafe might perform other translations alongside those which were explicitly intended. The business goal of management is to sell the internet experience using a computer to access the internet at a cafe as a product. And so, as far as this research was supposed to happen in a real life place, which is the internet cafe here, and perhaps some homes where people are connecting to the internet, perhaps even some roads that were traveled between this place and that place, because of course, if you are going to a cyber cafe to access the internet, you have to travel there, and that is part of the process. The idea of connecting people through these different roads, as much as the networks that they are using, as much as perhaps the rest of the world that is involved here, fundamentally changes our idea of geography, because it is a much bigger place all of a sudden once you consider all of the connections involved here. And as much as you could have limited this to a sort of a physical distance back when there were no computers, now there is this much greater awareness of how much reach a person can have, how much reach an idea can have over space and over time, and how much more quickly these new developments are happening for us than at any time before. And of course, in the context of Africa in the 90s, this was something that was seen as a complete anomaly, of course, that Africa was very much considered to be a developing country which had very little access to technology, very little exposure to the outside world. But this particular researcher found that very quickly that it is in fact not the case, and that in the context of using digital technology, there is no reason to make these assumptions. There is no reason to have these conversations about space the way that we used to. Now, of course, there is certainly an argument to be made about the quality of these technologies, that you might have high-speed internet versus a modem, for example, and those things are certainly a matter of convenience and economics that are part of the conversation. But it is kind of going at an increasing pace here, where you could have all kinds of people using all kinds of technologies at all kinds of different paces, and yet still sharing the same ideas, perhaps participating in the same culture. And participation here is obviously a big part of where we are going, because there is a way in which people will engage with the internet, and there are a variety of ways in which a variety of people will engage in the internet. And this is also not something that can be predicted pretty clearly. The Hanging Out book mentions this as genres of participation, which take shape as an overall constellation of characteristics and are constantly under negotiation and flux as people experiment with new modes of communication and culture. In this way, it is a construct amenable to our particular methods and our approach to looking at a dynamic and interrelated media ecology. Our approach is ecological rather than categorical. In the remainder of this chapter, we turn our attention to three genres of participation: hanging out, messing around, and geeking out, in an effort to define and describe how these genres emerge through use practice. And so, of course, here, this is the title of the book itself: hanging out, messing around, and geeking out. But those are what they call here modes of participation, because those three, which might seem to be kind of synonymous, kind of overlapping, play out in different ways based on the different involvements that different people have with the internet, with their computers, with the other people that they are relating to through their computers. And that creates an environment, or an ecology as it is called here, because now the worlds are created by this media, by these connections that people have, and essentially kind of roping off these particular forms of activities from the others by the fact that people are using them. And the context of ethnography here is important to realize how those things are different, because again, from the point of view of an external observer, the different activities mentioned here, hanging out, messing around, geeking out, they might not seem to be particularly different. They might not seem to be particularly meaningful if you don't have that first-hand view, if you don't have that particular experience as it is lived by the people involved. And the number one tool of ethnography in this context is to do interviews, to very much capture at long length the amount of data that people can have when they relate to their ecological environments. And because we are talking about ecology, we are talking about lived spaces, there are a million ways in which those interactions can play out. Narrative interviews, or sometimes called oral histories, are very much the center tool of the ethnographic approach. Interviewing is one more tool in the larger repertoire of methodologies that is used for history, anthropology, and folklore. Oral history collects information about the past from observers and participants in that past. It gathers data not available in written records about events, people, decisions, and processes. Oral history interviews are grounded in memory, and memory is a subjective instrument for recording the past, always shaped by the present moment and by individual psyche. Oral history can reveal how individual values and actions shape the past and how the past shapes present-day values and actions. Every interviewing experience is unique. This is part of the charm of fieldwork. So while there is some validity in the adage, the only way to learn how to do it is to do it, there are things that you can do before, during, and after your interviews to make every interview more successful. So, in fact, when you are going to do some kind of interviewing process, it is probably a good idea to prepare your interviews. And, you might know that from listening to podcasts, for example, where some podcast interviewers are better prepared than others to talk about their subjects, or even to talk about whatever it is that they had to do when they were podcasting. So the oral history aspect here is important because they are mentioning that it is a matter of the past, but the past doesn't have to be a very distant past. It could be what just happened literally a few minutes ago for our purposes here. It is about what has happened from a subjective point of view. It could be a distant past because sometimes that is often the case, but it could just as well be the matter of the lived experience that has unfolded and that has a fresh meaning in the person's mind as well. And in and of itself here, the method of oral histories, or as it's called here in these different articles, is something that is absolutely very common pretty much everywhere you look. Just like the interview process is something that is very common everywhere you look. And that's not to say that these disciplines are particularly borrowing or even stealing from anthropology, but it is kind of a testament of how a particular form of inquiry can be adopted in a variety of ways and perhaps can be taken to be something to be very popular and very in demand, in fact, for a variety of topics that may or may not be connected to one another. And of course, this is not a new realization for the context of anthropology itself. Del Hymes told us that when you have these ways in which people are going to have a lived experience recounted, there is a matter of classifying these particular forms of behaviors into what he called repertoires. On the general problem of assessing behavioral repertoire and alert student to the small portion of cultural behavior that people can be expected to report or describe when asked, and this much smaller proportion that an average person can be expected to manifest by doing on demand. Some social research seems incredibly to assume that there is to find out can be found by asking. So, then sometimes asking questions about things is useful. It's a way to get to the answer. But sometimes when you are making sense of this lived experience, asking questions will only give you one part of the information. And perhaps sometimes asking a question about one topic can yield another topic, or perhaps can yield an answer about something else. So just asking questions and maybe even really preparing those questions is only going to lead us into a variety of directions, as opposed to, again, trying to understanding this repertoire, as he calls it. So the larger, much larger context in which those lived experiences are happening for a variety of people. If you are trying to document the very specific way in which a very specific person is interacting with a very specific topic, you can ask them a very specific set of questions. But if you are trying to extend that conclusion to be a little bit wider, to be part of a cultural process, as we have mentioned in before, then it is obviously important to see those connections and to observe those connections that may not be um, done by the people who are involved or expected by the people that are involved. And you might need to read a little bit more into people's answers to get to the answers that you are particularly looking for yourself. And so anthropology, as a result of that, is not just a matter of oral history, not just a matter of having those subjective answers, because however much they are useful, they are also just one aspect of the research. And sometimes it is not even a 100% necessary part of the research either. Yeah, I've been emphasizing this today, and if you feel like you can do interview with people, you certainly can, or consider this as part of your research. But it is not a a deal breaker if you do not have an interviewing process involved here. Again, our job is to make sense of cultural movements as a whole, and sometimes you do not have witnesses, sometimes you do not have access to the subjective experiences firsthand. So anthropology has developed this whole system of inquiry that allows you to make sense of the repertoire as a whole, including being immersed yourself in that culture and experiencing it perhaps by yourself as if you were one of the members of that culture, which, as I've mentioned before, has led to some issues early in anthropology. The narrative interviews are important as much as the interactions with the environment itself. And again, trying those things out, looking at how those things are working out. It is also a matter of understanding the language and analyzing how the language may be different. Maybe somebody is calling two different things using the same name. Maybe somebody is calling the same thing with two different names. And this is a matter also of understanding how these particular relationships are playing out using a particular vocabulary. And language here should not be taken for granted. There is also what we have mentioned earlier this week, the archaeological or artifact analysis, looking at objects the same way an archaeologist would do that in the field. But again, something that could have been happening hundreds of thousands of years ago in the archaeological context is something that could have happened just a few minutes ago in the digital context as well. And perhaps, if at all possible, it could also be a matter of looking at human biology, how human interactions are changed on the biological level by the digital. And we're going to move on to that in the next few chapters, of course, because having access to digital methods has also very much changed some of our biological existence.